Okay, this is a recording about metatype and metagram. So philosophically, I'm still in a bit of a quandary. I don't know about my own theory. Well, in some way, I don't know if it's possible, if I can put it like this, to not be playing a game in life. That the soul is engaged in some mental activity, and mental activities will always be prone to um, karma or thought consequence. There'll always be a consequence in the thinking substrate. So you have to, I don't know if it's possible to play a game, a transcendental game, a game that's transcendental to thinking. No, that obviously sounds like it can be, because transcendentally you can choose to switch games. So you have a choice of game to play, but whatever game you play is going to have some kind of karmic load, but because of your ability to choose, you can be forthright in your selection. If you, in a kind of meta way, in a transcendental way, if you endorse your selection. So that's the only way that I can see that you can sort of transcend karma, is in, let's say, the self-awareness in that selection, or conscientiousness. That is a kind of transcendental conscientiousness. And that comes up to one's own volition to embrace the choice. Do you embrace the freedom to choose? And how much affinity can you find with that? Let's call it a basic fact. So there's a very simplistic source of joy that sort of transcends everything that you might be doing. But anyway, now I have not studied other metatype and false ego complexes, or I shouldn't say metatype, I should say, it's hard for me to know what the intrinsic internal game is. But it seems to me that metatype 13, or at least certain metagram types that have double circuits and things like that, they in some way have, perhaps to a lesser and a greater extent between them as well, have perhaps the keys to freedom. That I do keep on thinking that metatype 13 in particular, and at least my metagram, metatype 13, is capable of playing a transcendental game within metatype 13. And I don't know if that means that essentially all metagram types should seek to emulate them, or at least seek some kind of association. And when I say association, I mean like a kind of mental emulation of the type in order to gain access to a transcendental game. So I think that can be, and that's interesting, or that, because I would put that in parallel to the different gifts that different people are said to have in the Christian scripture, and how through communion the members in the body of Christ uplift each other and fortify each other, and perhaps fill in the different missing gifts, and that there's perhaps more than just headship. There's more than just the gift of the apostle. There's more than just right judgment, but it does make sense that one gift would perhaps also be a seed to the others. So I mean, I don't know, the gift of the apostle might stand on its own as a kind of as a sort of cultural starter for all the other ones as well. And that it only operates well in articulation, in actual active use, in conjunction with others. That then it makes the others come alive. Anyway, but in a kind of in the ambience that then is created by the gift of the apostle. But obviously this sounds very grandiose, linking my own type to the gift of the apostle. The other alternative is that, you know, there's just something that's off the table that I can't see because I'm just wrapped up in my own false ego complex, that there perhaps are ways of being in terms of not being in a metatype or a metagram, and one does not seek refuge within the personality styles that I have catalogued, that there might be other formulas or other ways of being that one does then extricate oneself from what I've called the false ego complex. But I mean, let me not semantically manacle myself, because if you replace, instead of calling it the false ego complex or something, or you could just call it a set of games. So, you know, the question is just, are there extraneous games to that set of games? And there might not be. Especially if there are some games which are within the set, which are potentially transcendental. And what I mean by that is that they're capable of overcoming themselves, but they're also not necessarily capable of overcoming themselves. I mean, I just do this because I seemingly come across other people who, as far as I can tell, have the same metatype as me, and also perhaps the same metagram type, but they haven't developed the second circuit in the same way that I have. And so they're functioning that metagram type as a single circuit, and they haven't yet sort of conjoined it or with the other circuit. So they are still in the kind of, they're not playing the game as a transcendental game, because they don't even have within the subset of that personality style, they don't have a choice to be made, because it's only when it's confronted with that choice that then one unlocks the transcendental faculty, as it were, which only gives you access to that simple joy that I spoke about earlier. Of identifying with that freedom to elect a decision, a choice. Which is, you know, almost itself a kind of a paradox, because if you contemplate it directly and you don't exercise it, if you just get wrapped up in its contemplation, then it kind of becomes like dust, doesn't resolve. So you have to link it to your actual choice in the moment, as it were, in the immediate actualization. There was something else that I wanted to talk about, and this really has to do with just semantics, I guess, or words. And that was, I might have already covered it in this recording, but let me. Yeah, people talk about self-actualization, but I think that that phrase does not have enough words in it. I think you have to say true self-actualization. And then having that extra word, does open that Pandora's box of the question, well, what is the truth, or something like that, or what makes it true? But that is something like a mystery that is inescapable, that you can't try to sort of snub the mystery by just contracting the concept and just calling it self-actualization. For the self to be actualized, you have to be a true self actualizing, an actualizing true self. Obviously, I mean, my solution to where the truth is sourced is epistemic responsibilism, in epistemic agency, that one, through the endorsement from one's own agency, that's what makes it true, is that you are taking responsibility for your choice, for your election. That radical self-ownership, that's what is then making you truly self-actualized. And then I would sort of add to this, well, there's two beautiful works of writing of Vasti Ruurt's work on nihilism, that essay, and Catherine Elgin's Epistemic Agency, I think is the name of the work. Just to philosophically define, well, the Vasti Ruurt's work sort of defines some of the psychological mechanics of actualizing it in words differently, but another way of describing that whole process is in Catherine Elgin's Epistemic Agency. Yeah, I must say I find those papers very complimentary. Okay, so let me perhaps repeat myself what I was saying at the start. If the only thing that you can do in life is play a game, and you're responsible for the criteria that you're using to choose which game you want to play, and you have, not an unlimited, not an unbound set of characteristics and criteria that you have to choose from. There's a kind of pragmatic field that you have to work within, or let's say dynamics of pragmatics, to make the best you can from, and with your definition of best or outlook as to what outcome you want to have wrought in the world. Construct out of the world. I mean, sadly, I've always found the limiting factor in this is more the lack of communication or coordination with others that comes from a kind of common understanding. That's primarily the limiting factor. And that, mostly what you do with the world is destined to end up being recycled by kind of the currents and the winds of change in other people's kind of unconscious meanderings. But, if we define truth as something like what's the phrase that I always used to use? An internal economy unto itself. That's not quite the phrase that I used to use, but a kind of its own internal economy of meaning and purpose. It can be conserved within that context. At least by those who receive the same style of I guess I'm trying to describe it. Is there a war that is worth being recruited into, or how to avoid describing it as a kind of karmic war? Within the context of a game, one can see forces that one is fighting against and hoping to come out victorious and vanquish the foe. And, just because the history hasn't already delivered to you inheriting the victorious position, but how not to be bogged down by the fact that it's just perhaps can be described as an eternal war, or pessimistically it can be described as an eternal war, but that is really a kind of a nihilistic, that sheds a kind of nihilism onto the basic question as to providing impetus to one's own election, providing meaning and purpose to one's own, that it already degrades the simple joy that I was talking about earlier. Because, to depict it just as an eternal war is to kind of already be overcome. That karma is greater than the election of the game or the embracing of the game that one chooses. It eventually, I mean, this all is boiling down to, do you outsource confidence or do you locate it internally within one's own economy of purpose and one's own economy of truth? Are you trying to externally source confidence from that? I guess, this has to do with, how concerned you are with vindicating a concept like justice. Or how interested one might be in the concept of justice and making it palpable or real, or it's interesting. I mean, this obviously has linkages to Enneagram Type 1. They call it the anger type. It's interesting that they call it anger, or actually, eights are also associated with anger. But Type 1s are usually obsessed with justice or reform. Enneagram might be a kind of taxonomy of games. It might just be that the one game that is associated with justice allows you to get deep enough that you can sort of see what you're doing, or it creates a framework that all the other things can fall or can be included within. It's interesting that they make Enneagram Type 1, or not that the numbers necessarily have such a significance, but I mean, the first Enneagram type is perhaps the most basic, the deepest form of game. Certainly the most impersonal, perhaps. I guess 4s could also be described as impersonal and abstract. Perhaps 6s as well. And 9s can, I think, be alienated from themselves even. But anyway, I would describe that kind of impersonal abstraction from the 4s and the 6s to be, anyway, on a more kind of superficial subject matter that is already engaged in quite an embedded obsession, or within life itself. It's attached to or associated with a either a kind of escapism, or whereas the issues of Enneagram 1 seem to offer a transcendental note. Or anyway, that's my... It's interesting that I think something can be salvaged from Enneagram Type 2. Therefore, that there's something between Enneagram 1 and Enneagram 2 that is unlocked through Enneagram 1 and then actualized, or as a choice that you can kind of lean towards Enneagram 2 being the helper of some transcendental on some transcendental. Anyway, I'm kind of butchering Enneagram theory quite badly. I should rather perhaps have not brought it up. But I mean, that's the problem. There's no Enneagram type 10 theorized, so it's not a very helpful model for dealing with what I'm trying to speculate about at the moment. You know, I've always wondered how much different society might be if in the therapist chamber, if in the therapeutic alliance, there wasn't potential recourse to a social structure that just had more integrity. Because, you know, that, let's say, people could be reasoned with in a way that had more consequence. You know, that if everything was subject to a kind of truth and reconciliation commission as part of the justice system of a society, if then, you know, therapists would be potential advocates or solicitors to go and sort out people's business, that perhaps being quite utopian. I don't mean that in that that would guaranteed solve the human condition, but that might be a key to sort of a more sane population. I've wondered about the huge proliferation of anxiety and ADHD and things like that. And I really, you know, especially the increasing prevalence of these things, it makes me think that there's an internalization of a kind of macro societal injustice. In the same way that, I mean, explicitly, this is how things like some forms of anorexia and bulimia develop. They develop based on a kind of principled thinking about generalizing the state of the world into a universalist kind of, you know, it's almost as if there's a hunger strike going on until the world feels like everyone is being given something that is personally regarded as a kind of on principle and necessity, that people don't have freely available to them. There isn't a kind of universal mental conditioning. And that kind of ideation and obsession with, I do see this as similar to borderline person, or similar to some elements of borderline personality disorder, which is again similar to, I'm going to take some language from Sam Wagner's narcissism, because I don't, the introjective paradigm is what is being imported and what is being believed in. That there should be an introjective paradigm in the external world that is the same as the internal obsession for yoking everything into the same matrix, so that the world cosmically centers around something, that the whole world revolves around the same arbitration or adjudication machine, which is something, like an internal God. And I think that this all skirts around the issue of justice. That, if you have a philosophy about justice and then a personal linkage to it, then you can be forthright in the world as an agent, just as much as one can be an agent, and a partisan for justice and mediating justice. In a world in which you are limited by coordination and communication and negotiation and pragmatic dynamics. But obviously, when all of those pragmatic dynamics are kind of replaced by an introjective paradigm where the external must just be a carbon copy of some internal obsession to have everything under the yoke of a centralizing kind of God principle, then you end up with a crude so-called justice, or a poor substitute for justice, that is itself the kind of the abrogation of the mechanics of life, and also choice and self-election. You become enslaved. So you choose a kind of slavery to this introjective paradigm principle. And I do think that, both ADHD and I keep on thinking now, the more that I think about it, I think that there are almost only three psychopathologies that are manifesting in radically different symptomologies. Anyway, so it makes me think that reasoning around the principle of justice and, let's say, the actualization of justice into a kind of moral foundation would be the antidote to a lot of this mental illness. And so when I talk about therapists being solicitors or advocates, I guess what I mean, more importantly than trying to force people to do things that they don't want to do, just that they help navigate their client, or perhaps even communicate on their behalf, to adjust relationship dynamics, by sort of setting down adding complexity where, and therefore room for articulation. When I say articulation here, I mean activating faculties which have been suppressed by the addiction or the obsession with the introjective paradigm, sort of God principle. Just wishing for that ideation on the inside to be the ruling factor on the outside, which is a very borderline feature, I would say. Let me just give a quick summary of what I consider borderline to be. So the basic definition, I think, of borderline is that the individual has seemingly a personal relationship with an external locus of control. They have an intimate connection to what should be, in their estimation, an external locus of control, or something that is an external locus of control. And then that formula gets embedded in their relationships. Their relationships get crafted around sort of deposing people in relation to that concept of that external locus of control, which is their introjective paradigm. So their set of expectations. So it's all about vindicating the borderline's sentiments so that they can trust their feelings unquestioningly. They just have to experience them, and they will be in the right relationship to the external locus. So, the question is, are they obsessed with their own emotionality, or are they actually obsessed with there being a mirror or a twin to their introjective paradigm being this external locus of control? And breaking down that connection is obviously the development of some kind of justice substitute or reasonableness substitute. It's a philosophical moral development of some kind. But the excuse will be that in their upbringing they got away with it, or what was modeled to them was so chaotic and abusive or unreasonable that they deserve to have recourse to this obsession, this ideation of this external locus of control, which is intimately beholden to them being able to read it, to read this introjective paradigm through their emotional affectation. So I mean, it basically boils down to the fact that these people they think that they are incredibly, in a sense, that they have extra special senses, that their sense of what's going on takes precedence, that they have a kind of extra an extra special perceptivity, and breaking down that extra special perceptivity with complexity means breaking the addiction and breaking the obsession with the introjective paradigm. So the development of sophistication displaces that introjective paradigm. And this is, I think, innately known by borderlines. I don't think borderlines are like narcissists. Borderlines can stop being borderline instantaneously. It really is just an addiction for them, and they can get over it right away. The problem with narcissists is that all the narcissist needs to do is grow up, but they don't have the resources to because I do think that the narcissist experiences the introjective paradigm as an external entity, as an external form. It's not as internal as the borderline. I do think the general solution is that I do think a narcissist can evolve into something more like a borderline and heal that way. I think I'm speculating now, so this is obviously dangerous to openly speculate, but I do think that that is much more viable, because in a kind of behaviorism of enacting the internal relationship that the borderline has with the introjective paradigm, at least allows that the content of the introjective paradigm to be encapsulated into a system. And if that system can be observed by the narcissist, as the narcissist tries to um, consume that subject matter, as a consume is probably the wrong word, but to deal with that subject matter in as a canonical, or as a complete categorical field, then it can start to the narcissist can start to have realizations about that field as a whole, which then can evolve into, let's say, moral education or substitution of using the introjective paradigm. But I think the problem is that the narcissist doesn't experience the introjective paradigm as a paradigm. It just is their experience. They're kind of atomized within it. They are merely an agent within the matrix. They're not close to the architect. Whereas borderlines are more like the consort of the architect. Anyway, I've jumped around here and gone to different, and then I think the third. Okay, so I've kind of dealt with borderlines and narcissists, and obviously this is a bit of a crude taxonomy of saying that there are only three types of mental illness, or at least psychological disturbance. The third type, borderline, I think is like a different kettle of fish. Um, Borderline, I think, has to do with that there are two personality circuits, and once they start repressing each other or getting in competition with each other, the one circuit starts creating an alternative unconscious primary counter offer or a virtual primary counter offer, and that just destabilizes the personality style, because the stimulus will actually be disengaged from, and so the ego can actually become completely untethered, and only be attached to this virtual primary counter offer. And so you end up, I think, eventually even having the shadow of a completely separate stimulus or subconscious. But that might even be, I don't know if it's that bad. I mean, well, obviously, getting to that point is very tumultuous, but if you can at least find some stability, or at least, no, actually, probably would never be that easy to survive with, and collecting the right, it would probably need a lot of guidance to be able to follow this stuff. But because the shadow of having a separate subconscious, I think I was going to say, that seems like a tremendous resource for being able to transcend the false ego complex, and see that it's just a game that you're playing, and that you're doing it to yourself, and that you made a game, or you developed a game, which is your psyche, which is your psychological personality that you're playing in this life, and then you broke down your own game and you made an alternative to it that breaks the cage, as it were. And then the only way to subsume that or to survive that is to realize that, okay, well, choose the game that you're playing and play a consistent game, because otherwise you're going to be very aberrated. You're going to be very split and polluted or disjointed or incoherent. And so, when you come across a lot of borderline personality, at least type 1, borderline, sorry, not borderline, bipolar. Sorry, was I saying borderline this whole time? That's terrible. I meant to be saying bipolar. If you come across bipolar type 1, the sense that you primarily get is that these people are afraid. They're incoherent. In a kind of teleological sort of way. That they're teleologically open because they've had, their stimulus has been their subconscious structure has been supplanted at least once, if they've had a major manic episode as a bipolar type 1. Which, I mean, it reduces confidence in the structure of the false ego complex. It gives one access to the fact that it's all an illusion. I've often said that, the best metaphor for this is in Full Metal Alchemist. People that can do transmutation circles because they've seen the gate, they've seen the truth, they've seen through the door to another world. They've gone back to the source. Within this lifetime, they've had a reset. They've had a bit of a rebirth or a reincarnation in their subconscious. And that all because their unconscious, their virtual primary counteroffer, gave them a completely alternative activity to be doing in order to supposedly serve the same game. So they got to play the game twice in two different things, in two different avatars or tokens. So they're kind of left with this quandary around tokens. The tokenage of game playing. Which I think is quite sad. If you don't have a deep spiritual tradition that kind of covers this kind of stuff philosophically, you can imagine someone's been burnt, they've been frayed by a very deep fundamental structure of psychological reality, and there's no guidance. And it's not that the subconscious has been supplanted. Well, it is that it's how the subconscious has been supplanted. It's because the virtual primary counteroffer has actually given rise to a separate subconscious that does the same activity. Yeah, it's the poison of the virtual primary counteroffer, that there is actually a different methodology to life. Kind of unwinds the threading of the soul itself, in some sense, gives a kind of creates a kind of existential quandary, which is perhaps what I was going into right at the start of this recording. Because it's one thing to know that you're playing a game, it's another thing to actually know for certain that you could be playing another game. Not just hypothetically, but actually that you have been playing, you did at one time play a completely alternative game, and the existential dread that there's an alternative to what you are playing is a weight, which then has to be woven into the new subconscious, if there is a stable subconscious to emerge from that, a more transcendental subconscious, or one that has to carry that burden. Um, I think bipolar type 2s, either they have recourse to the virtual primary counter offer, but they don't ever split their subconscious. Their subconscious stays, because they don't have a complete separate circuit to independently be developed, and therefore to create they just don't have the metagram resources to develop a completely separate psychology to supplant their initial psychology. So in some sense, they just get a reinforced. So I've always thought that bipolar type 2s were particularly spiritually toxic people. That they're extra fortified and extra, what's the word? Let's say immune to realizations, or to progress, or to development of, this stuff about games, and because they're so fortified in the game that they are playing, gets reinforced by two modes, and they'll switch between the two at their convenience. They'll kind of use the one to cover the other one. So they end up with a rigged game. So I've always found that bipolar type 2 individuals, to have a kind of existential sadism, even, if I could even put it like that. I'm not describing it that well, but I wonder if all these, maybe there's some forms of borderline personality disorder that, in sort of the stuff that I was talking about earlier, like people who are very anxious and have ADHD and things like that. Or maybe even narcissism. I wonder if if narcissism might have a direct connection to kind of borderline type 2 personality structure developing. Which is why it's so hard for them to develop an internal locus of control, because they're using a virtual primary counter offer, which is borderline type 2s, I think, that phrase that I'm using, virtual primary counter offer, might not even be appropriate. Because it might be more of a natural resource, which they have growing up much more readily available to them, because it doesn't involve supplanting the subconscious. So if it's developed a lot more easily, and then you've got sort of two sets of tools to prove your subconscious right, which I've always thought that as well. Then their subconscious tends to be more crude, because it employs two separate methodologies interchangeably. So they just have less beliefs, or their beliefs are fundamentally more pliable. So then it's almost impossible to develop an internal locus of control. I think I must develop this thought more in another recording, but yeah, I think that's quite important. The linkage between narcissism and bipolar type 2. That's something I should try to explore. This is an addendum to my last recording, so I wanted to talk more about this possibility of this bipolar type 2 metatype or metagram circuit of a personality style. So if you have that kind of configuration, so it'll be one of the classes of double circuit or semi-double circuit. I just wanted to expand this idea because I think that piggybacking on the other idea that I sometimes talk about, that I do think that ideology and sometimes things that happen in groups of people exemplify personality styles. And so, something that you actually get a complex of individuals that are relating to one another almost inside the scaffolding of a psycho-pathology. And I was thinking, people often talk about, kind of like, well, narcissists have seemingly lots of influence over their environment. I think borderlines have more of an influence than narcissists do often. But I guess they can both have similar relations to people where they're so bad at reality checking things, they need to stress people in their environment in order to gauge or to sort of to source vicarious subconscious stability. But I still think that the narcissist and the borderline are doing this for very different reasons. Anyway, I think narcissism is particularly hard to talk about because I've spoken about it ad nauseum before, because once you start getting into the issue of core motivation, it eventually turns out to be such a hollow structure that, it's just looking, at some sense, its core motivation is just that it wants something else to mirror it so that it can see itself. It's looking for the Oedipal pool of water to see the reflection in. Oh, I think, sorry, I just misspoke. I was trying to mention the Greek myth, but I think I got the myths mixed up. Oedipal was something else. It's not narcissistic. It was Narcissus who was in love with his own reflection. I don't know. Was there no pool of water with a reflection in the Oedipal myth? I'm not even sure, but a lot of things happen to Oedipal, I think. Anyway, but Oedipal, the whole plot was unconscious. But anyway, let me not change the subject. So anyway, I just wanted to maybe a little bit expand. This is so sophomoric, but anyway, on the idea of the borderline type 2 that I was describing, which is, I think, has the same components that I see engaging when people are narcissistic. I think there might be the same metagram circuit structure. If that's true, I'm just trying to also expand on how that operates as a collective complex of individuals that are engaged in the same thing. And I think that, when people are in toxic situations where there's a toxic social dynamic, and you can kind of see that there is a culture of a kind of faux intellectualism, or value. There's a kind of faux value, or there's a currency of doubling down on derision and obfuscation and constantly diverting and deferring blame into a deeper critique of something else. And so, it's often, I think, always, it needs to be in association with, it only sort of operates as a beta kind of it only works in the shadow of another power structure, a kind of subculture, so that it can always defer blame onto something that's actually providing the value. And then it plays this game that if anything tries to be dissatisfied with this toxic culture, it says, well, you're just trying to do the same thing that we're trying to do. You're trying to be a dissident. But you're trying to break the mold too much, whereas we've got a stable reactionary dissatisfaction. So it's kind of like a psycho-pathology around cornering the market on dissatisfaction or derision. And it also does this by having pliable beliefs. So if you don't have stable beliefs, but you just are working through this formula and are constantly applying this formula, what matters more is almost in a sophistry sort of way that one is able to express displeasure, that one is able to point out somebody else's error or something like that. And context is always sort of lost because there is no, it's all about airing dissatisfaction or being the avatar of some kind of this is a complicated idea. So it's sort of, I mean, because this is how I would see it's the same personality style, but acting on the scale of a social, within an association, is that everyone gives a wide berth, or at least a basic respect, to this kind of tokenage of being the avatar of dissatisfaction, as if, that's the only stable commodity. You're somewhat indulging in the error of somebody else, and it's always easy to manufacture errors because you just need to sort of apply an incoherent or an inconsistent standard, and you can force an error in your perception, or through filtering perception in that way. And I do think that there is a natural filtering going on in this personality style, but it can be replicated or emulated within a social dynamic. Yeah, so I mean, I would call it the misapplication of via negativa, um, as being the highest axiomatic teleos. Hmm. And seemingly acting it out and doing it on a small scale. And what I mean by that is acting it out as a cog, as a cultural denizen of an association that is collectively employing itself in doing this as a collective. And so you can just kind of indulge in it as a kind of robot. Yeah, perhaps I've gone too far here, trying to extrapolate a circuit type into a stable psychopathology. I don't think, yeah, I mean, having to talk about it like this is forcing me to keep it very loose and abstract. But, there's also, I think, the sense, in which, because it doesn't have any stable beliefs, its beliefs are more like pliable implements that are useful to coming up with cutting, sharp, derisive perspectives. It's I guess it might classify itself as a form of skepticism, a kind of I think what I'm really talking about is almost falls under some things that I've spoken about in the past, where I talk about the cult of TI, introverted thinking. That you can just abuse logical thinking, so called, and seeming, like where there's only rationality but there's no reasonableness, because there's no sort of positive use of reasoning. It's only negative. Yeah, so you get this kind of abrasive quality. But it would also make sense that, therefore, this critical faculty that has two separate voices or two separate bites at the cherry mean that it's very hard for this personality style, or it's very easy for this personality style to become disturbed in early life. So it's not just that these children were traumatized by bad parents, but that there was a combination of receptivity to not formulating a stable subconscious. Somewhat being governed by an overdetermined unconscious, or an overdetermining unconscious over the subconscious. So the subconscious stays pliable and, in some sense, has to exalt so you don't really get a stable subconscious, but you do get a subconscious that has to be organized around some kind of stylistic principle of going in one direction, or well, I don't know. I think these people, bipolar type 2s, if I said that bipolar type 1 seem like people that have been burnt or they've been frayed, I think the type 2s are sort of this, seemingly are belligerent in their lack of subconscious cohesion. Or they just have a deep sense of disquiet, that there is no stable mooring, that there never was, perhaps, growing up in childhood. Because the only subconscious structure that they can manage to develop is whatever is capable of passing the test of both modes of unconscious. And so you've got double the work. Like whenever I think this is a good way. This is a decent enough metaphor. It's as if everything you say is being interpreted twice. So what it is that you end up being able to say has a lot of dynamism and hidden meaning, and a kind of toxic interpolation that's laden. And then just extending that metaphor in terms of the actual, therefore, the content of the subconscious is half as strenuous. It has to be stylistically brittle or pliable. So it's like a lot of hay. That can be easily reconfigured and bent around and moved into different shapes. And I would say that, that in practice usually comes to being overly preoccupied with what other people are doing. So instead of focusing on the fact that you lack an internal coherent organizational strategy, you are focused on the substandardness of other people's teleological strategies, which you can pick apart in a with a kind of sophistry. So you can find other people substandard by just employing your logical sophistry to tear them apart, and everything is always outwardly focused on consuming something else, on somebody else. Now, this might just be the most natural state for people with this kind of circuitry to develop into. That this is what I'm describing is basically the outline of what the most common manifestation is likely to be, but there might be a kind of inverted version of this, which comes out as a kind of self-awareness and ultra-conscientiousness, and a huge anxiety over, I've heard that there are, very anxious bipolar type 2s, but I've personally not had a lot of contact with those types, so I can't, not being a clinician myself, I don't have a breadth of experience, but it is interesting as well. I think that I think some people that do have this type of circuit, maybe because of their metatype or some other peculiarity feature of one of their metagram emotional tones, or the actual core of the false ego complex, the what I'd often refer to as the semantic death, whatever that actual command was, that they just had more cohesion and an ability to develop something like a subconscious core, so that they wouldn't be prone to a kind of stylistic sketchy fragmentation, or let's say dysfunctional subconscious core. I do think that how I'm characterizing narcissism now is essentially that it is outwardly focused. That it introjects introjective objects are all sourced in a kind of external locus of control, which already has a kind of karmic load or currency that one has to basically respect as a kind of brute force adherence, and then the narcissist is just wanting to trade in that. And so I've just said that, let's say the most common manifestation of this, I'm just extrapolating, would be then to deal in dissatisfaction or cornering the market of some form of stylistic way of finding dissatisfaction with things, because then you have an opinion coming from your beliefs, which is always going to be pertinent to that external locus of control, that karmic system. And I'm just trying to see how well this matches with my speculation that this dovetails to people that have a particular configuration of circuit type within metagram. Okay, well, I guess there's probably enough speculation. Can't really make too much more progress than that. At some point I must probably do a video with diagrams showing how many types have how many subdivisions of circuit type that you can make, and the proportionality of them. We just might give a rough estimate as to the proportion of the population, how that comes down. I mean, you can't assume this, but just roughly assuming that all 48 metagram types are evenly represented in the population, and then just subdividing them by circuit type might be interesting. I think there are only like 6 out of 48 that have double circuits. And then you can make a subdivision, I think, between 4 out of those 6 and 2 out of those 6 are different. I think 4 out of the 6 are like me, and 2 out of that 6 could also be grouped into another subdivision depending on what features you anyway. I must do a proper video of that at some point, probably.